Hi everyone, my name is Beth Perdue. I'll be your storyteller for today, and this is Forgotten Threads, so welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the Royal Poinciana Hotel. So, if you were to drive north on Coconut Row in Palm Beach, Florida, just past the Flagler Museum, you are driving through a ballroom. You won't see it, there's no plaque at that spot, but the road cuts squarely through where the octagonal ballroom of the Royal Poinciana Hotel used to stand, a room where the wealthiest people in America danced every winter for 40 years. The hotel was the largest wooden structure or building in the world. It slept 2,000 people and it had 3 miles of hallways. However, almost nothing of the structure still survives to this day. Today, I'll tell you what it was, and then I'll show you a postcard that ended up in my hands and what it took to work out who was holding it originally. To understand the hotel, you have to understand Henry Flagler, and Flagler's Florida story starts with illness. He married Mary Harkness in 1853. She was sick for years, and like I had discussed in one of my previous videos, the doctors up north were actually prescribing people to go down south to Florida in order to enjoy the winter months, enjoy the mild winter that we have down here, and get an escape, allow their bodies to rest and recuperate from the harsh winters that are up north. Well, Mary was sick for many, many years, and in 1878, the doctors sent them south to Jacksonville for the climate. This is the first time Florida enters into Flagler's life, and it enters as a medical prescription, not as an investment, at least not right off. Mary, however, died in New York City in 1881. 2 years later, he married again, Ida Alice Short, or Shroud, who had been Mary's nurse. He took her to Florida on their honeymoon, a journey of roughly 90 hours. Again, we discussed this in one of my earlier videos. In fact, I think it was my first video, a trip to Florida. And we talked about how long it would take people to get down to Florida from these northern states. They reached Jacksonville, went on to St. Augustine, and Flagler looked at a town with no decent hotel and no reliable railroad and saw the entire thing laid out in front of him. Trains back then, there were multiple companies in the South, specifically in Florida, that owned different railroads. And the railroads down here in the South were a different measurement compared to those up north. So when the northern trains were coming down, they could only go so far, and then you had to change over to another train, and then from there you'd have to change over to another train. So it was this long, arduous process of all these multiple companies owning the railroad. Flagler fixed that, however, and purchased a lot of those companies and was able to make I think it was the Florida East Coast Railway. A topic for another conversation, but just to kind of put into perspective why it would take 90 hours to travel from New York, New Hampshire, any of those states up there down here to Florida, and especially not that far down into Florida. By 1885, he was back and he was building. From that point on, Flagler and St. Augustine were effectively the same story. The second marriage ended badly. In 1895, Ida Alice was declared incurably insane and she was committed. Flagler never visited her again. Florida law did not permit divorce on grounds of insanity, but this is an interesting little note. So in 1901, the Florida legislature passed a law that did. Flagler was the only person ever divorced under it. It was repealed 4 years later. 2 weeks after the divorce, the 71-year-old Flagler married 36-year-old Mary Lily Keenan. Now let's get back to the hotel because that's the whole point of this. But you have to know a little bit of the backstory, a little bit about who Flagler was, how he got involved in the hotels down here in Florida, and why it was important to him. So the Royal Poinciana opened on the 11th of February, 1894. 540 rooms, 6 stories, painted yellow and white, facing Lake Worth, surrounded by gardens. It cost over $1 million. 17 guests turned up for the first day. That did not last. By the second season, there were close to 1,000. Flagler expanded in 1899 and again in 1901 until the building ran 1,800 feet long along the lake, held over 1,000 rooms, and could take around 2,000 guests. The dining room alone seated 1,600 people. The corridors ran more than 3 miles, and the bellhops actually delivered messages by bicycle because it would take too long for them to walk. It had its own power plant, its own bakery, its own post office. This was not really a hotel. It was a miniature city. It was a wonderful precursor to what we see at Disney today. Rates ran from around $5 a day at the bottom end of the price tag to $100 for a suite. $5 in 1926 money is roughly $95 today. 100 is closer to 1900 in today's money. So basically it's the difference between like the low budget resorts for Disney or the Disney Good Neighbor hotels, I think is what they call them, compared to their upscale, very high-end resorts that we have. Now, for this, the plumbing was communal. One bathroom shared between 3 or 4 bedrooms. I would not like that at all. And that was simply what a hotel was. Even at the higher end of that market, that's just how hotels were run. What they advertised instead was electric light, genuinely novel at the time and pitched as a headline amenity. And the fire escape. This one cracks me up. It was not a rope. Usually back then they just kind of threw a rope out the window and you hopefully scaled down in your, 30 pounds of dresses and whatever you were wearing. This particular fire escape system was a rope that was a pulley system. You would tie it around your waist and you would, in a reporter's words of the day, slowly, safely, and majestically to the ground. Majestically. Wow, even the way you fled a burning building was supposed to have a little bit of style to it. No cars were permitted anywhere on the property, and guests were moved around in white wicker carts called Afromobiles. Yes, you know exactly where I'm going with this. And we need to stop for just 1 minute because it's doing a really interesting look back into history. Remember, we do not want to compare history with the lens of today. We do not want to, yes, there is right and wrong. There's always right and wrong, but we don't want to apply all of our standards that we know today to what life was like back then. It was a different world, different rules applied. These Afromobiles were wicker chairs, and I've got a video I'm going to post on maybe both sides. I don't know. And it was pedaled by a black hotel worker. On one side of the lake, the hotel orchestra would play for you on the beach, and this is interesting, Pinkerton detectives actually moved around throughout the property, attending all of the activities and the parties, the dinners, all of that, and they were in plain clothes, so they were like plainclothes police officers, and they were keeping all of the shenanigans and, five-finger discounted people at bay. The end arrived from 3 directions at once. So this is kind of an interesting, perfect storm that created the finale to this fantastic, beautiful, really ornate hotel. So in December of 1926, the rebuilt Breakers, which is another hotel, reopened down the road, newer and smarter, and the fashionable crowd simply moved, which is very common. I mean, you come out with something new and people want to try something new. It may not mean that it's bigger or better or more amazing. It just might mean that it's new and people want to try something new. It was absolutely breathtaking in all of its abilities and things that were for that day, but it was getting older. In September 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane drove water through 1,400 rooms and shifted the north wing of its foundation, off of its foundation. This was a amazing hurricane in all of the worst ways. If you look into this hurricane, I've discussed it in earlier videos, just the things that it affected, the lasting impacts that it made not only on houses and places of business, but on the landscape itself. Other accounts say that the hotel limped on until 1931 or that it wasn't formally closed until 1934. What every source agrees on is that it stood empty for years before the wreckers arrived, and that demolition was finished by about 1936. They took it apart and the lumber went back out into the county and became houses, roughly 40 of them that dotted the beach. The largest wooden building on earth is still standing in Palm Beach County. It's just standing in 40 pieces with families inside, which brings me to the postcard. So here's a postcard. Really pretty. You can see written across the bottom, it says the Royal Poinciana Hotel. It does have writing on the back, and I have put a copy of that writing in one of these two sides here. The writing is somewhat difficult to read because it is so tiny and some of it's kind of smudged out here towards the end. But I was able to look up a couple of things, and we're going to talk about that. Now, enjoy a little bit of animation that I have created. This animation is from multiple images from the hotel itself, and you'll be able to kind of see a little journey from this postcard in through the front doors, along the porch, and in through one of the dining halls and the front lobby. So it's a short little trip, but kind of gives you an idea of what it possibly looked like in color for that day and age. This postcard was mailed to a Mrs. M.E. Cook at 56 Glenbrook Road, Stamford, Connecticut, around 1926. It actually is postmarked 1923. The 26 comes from just doing some research on that particular area. My first assumption was the obvious one, that somebody wealthy probably took a trip down south and they were sending a postcard back home. That assumption may possibly be wrong, and the reason is kind of interesting thing that I learned while making this. A postcard of a famous hotel is not evidence that anybody stayed in it. And in fact, on the back of the hotel, the lady who wrote it is talking about how they took their lunch and they ate their lunch in a small little grove near this hotel. So they may have gone in the lobby, picked up a postcard. Maybe there was a place in town that was selling postcards. Remember, postcards were a huge way for people to advertise for their business, for tourism down here in Florida. So they would have been everywhere. Now, the postcard itself it's not evidence that she stayed there. The Royal Poinciana was the most photographed building in Florida during this time. This postcard was the generic greetings from Palm Beach, and it has the name of the hotel, sold in probably every drugstore and newsstand and pretty much anywhere you can find a postcard to purchase for a penny. Buying one meant you were near Palm Beach, not really much more. And remember who else was near Palm Beach? 1,400 seasonal workers, people who follow the resort season, northern hotels in summer and Florida in winter, and who wrote home. So there was a massive amount of people it was almost a 1-for-1 ratio of people who stayed in the hotel and people who worked in the hotel. And remember, it was a community. A lot of them stayed in dormitories. They were there for the season that the majority of people would be coming down from the north to enjoy the warmer climate. A card from somebody working the seasons, it might have been that, who knows? There is a way to kind of tell or kind of look into this. Palm Beach and West Palm Beach were two different post offices on two sides of the same lake. One was the island, the hotels, the money. The other was the mainland where the workforce lived and rowed from. So in other words, a lot of these people would get to work by rowing over. So the whole question was Mrs. Cook's correspondence being served or serving? Comes down to about 9 letters on a smudged postcard, and I'm still kind of working on it. I'll tell you what I find later on. I did do a little bit of research, and the neighborhood, this Glenbrook neighborhood that she lived in, does not exist in that form anymore. It was actually torn down, I believe, in like the 30s. So it wasn't long after that this part of her neighborhood would have been torn down. Everyone remembers the 2,000 guests. Everybody remembers the wealthy people, the flagglers, the people who came from up north to enjoy the climate. The 1,400 people who made it run went home. And mostly what they left behind is a penny postcard mailed north to a street in Connecticut or wherever else in the country they want to mail to. Who knows? Maybe this person was mailing to their mother. Maybe this person was mailing back to themselves and just giving almost like a diary. Remember, I talked about how to keep a journal and that your journal may one day be something that someone writes their dissertation on or their paper for college on because you took the time to write something down. Well, this postcard is doing just that. This postcard, over 100 years later, is now in my hands. I get to look at the history behind the image on the postcard, but also the people. Remember, this is about connections to people. So go read a postcard, go write a postcard, go write a postcard to yourself, mail it. Keep up the journal. I'll put a link to the free journal down below again, your travel journal. And when you go places, write about them because you never know